Hi. This is going to be my second in these political videos, triggered by the fact that I had a comment from one of my viewers, I presume he's Russian, with a lot of the usual criticism of the West, and of course defense of the Russian actions surrounding the Ukraine. And also because Vladimir Putin had a very interesting 3.5-hour conversation with the Russian people today via television. I had a look at some of it. What I'm going to say about the situation there is going to undoubtedly reflect, my prejudices. It's going to reflect the different sources of information that I have. Other people start out with different prejudices and have different sources of information and will have different perspectives. And I think it's always important that we have a great mixture of different points of view, and we don't necessarily convince anyone, but looking at different perspectives forces us to think. Where should I start? I think what we're dealing with here, I mentioned in my previous video that we're dealing with sort of competing national identities. And so at the beginning, let's go back to Kiev, to the Maidan. It seems to me that the Maidan was initially largely peaceful, largely call it the middle class or the bourgeois class, that section of the Ukrainian population that wanted to live more like Europeans. It was initially not that large a scale, peaceful. And it grew. Then on, I think, November the 30th or something, they were attacked quite violently by the Ukrainian police. And from that point on, things escalated. First of all, in terms of size, they then attracted a much larger group of Ukrainians who weren't necessarily so pro-European, but were shocked by the violence of the Ukrainian police, viciously beating unarmed journalists and students and even women, if I remember correctly. So at that point, violent elements, call them the right sector, which is more of almost a paramilitary organization, came to the fore in the Maidan, and the confrontations between the police and the demonstrators grew more and more violent. Also, there were much larger crowds, from maybe 20, 50,000 people. It grew at one point to 3, 4, 500,000 people who were protesting largely on weekends against the police brutality. And people there came from all over Ukraine, although primarily from Kiev and from Western Ukraine. And this then eventually led to the events of February 21st, by that time the violence had escalated. There had been, vicious attacks by the more violent people on the Maidan against the police. The police had organized various gangs of thugs who were kidnapping some of the demonstrators, hauling them out of hospital, taking them off, torturing them. I mean, it was a pretty vicious confrontation, which then resulted in the sniper attacks of the 21st of February. And I'm quite convinced that once all the investigation is done, and this will be passed over to to some kind of an international tribunal, that we will see that in fact Yanukovych and his security apparatus basically gave the instructions for these sniper attacks, which killed 80 people, innocent, unarmed people. Yes, or in the course of the Maidan, in the course of the violent confrontations, some 20-odd police were also killed, because there were some very violent people on the side of the demonstrators, but that's not where it started. So, now, what happened then was that Yanukovych fled. Now, he still controlled the security apparatus, he controlled the army. I can't understand why, from his perspective, as the elected president, why he didn't maybe go to Donetsk or go to Kharkov, where he felt more secure, and then make that sort of his center of operations to try to win back, the country. He didn't. He fled. And it was subsequently discovered that he had stolen billions of dollars from Ukraine. He had these incredibly luxurious houses in Kiev and on the Crimea and so forth and so on. And other members of his entourage had behaved similarly. So Yanukovych is now out. He is no longer, he fled his responsibilities. He's no longer the government. What's left? The parliament in Ukraine, the parliamentarians voted in a new government. A new government which included some people from the party Svoboda, which is a far-right party, which included, I think, one or two people from the right sector, but which was essentially the majority of the people, and the ones most active in that government are from the Batishina, whatever it's called, Fatherland Party. In other words, call them liberal, democratic type people. That's the case with Yatsenuk, that's the case with Turchinov, that's the case with one of their spokesmen, that's the case with the foreign minister, and so forth and so on. The interior minister is a businessman from Kharkov. So that what then happened was the Russians, and I think that Putin felt that things had gotten out of his control. From then on, everything in the Ukraine was chaos. Everything in the Ukraine, where the government was fascist, banderovцы, putschist, whatever. In other words, instead of saying, here's a government that is weak, disorganized, interim, trying to somehow keep this country together until they can have another election, presidential election, hopefully also parliamentary election, so that they can then have people again choose whom they want to govern their country. The Russians chose not to do that. The Russians chose to attack. They attacked in terms of propaganda. They attacked in terms of using their military, although Putin initially denied it. He said those are not our soldiers, but it was their soldiers who helped organize the takeover of Crimea, which was then legitimized in a referendum that was run like no other referendum. There was no freedom of expression for both sides to present their positions like we did in Quebec twice for a referendum. Very strict rules about how much money could be spent on advertising and who could advertise. In Crimea, it was, do you want the fascists who are coming to get you, or do you want to improve your pension and wage scale and become a part of Russia? So I quite willing to accept that a majority of people in Crimea were at that point happy to join Russia. However, not 97%, because there is no question that you're going to get 97% yes on. What the real number is, we simply don't know, because given that the Russians were prepared to force this thing through in 10 days, not change the question several times, not ensure that both sides had an equal opportunity to present their views, I have no idea what other falsification took place. I do know that on 3 separate occasions in 2 previous years, opinion polls in Crimea showed that 30 or 40% of the people were in favor of joining Russia. I can imagine that with their displeasure at the government in Kiev, with the heavy propaganda barrage from Russia, that number would have gone over 50%. I also think that a majority of people there probably were more concerned about their daily lives, standard of living, security, than they were about whether they wave a Russian flag or a Ukrainian flag. So, however, that's now water under the bridge. And then we see basically a repeat of that scenario in the east, in areas like in the Donbass region and elsewhere in eastern and southern Ukraine. Again, obviously well-trained, well-equipped army types, and then a collection of a ragtag band of local, God knows what types of people who have now been given arms and are charging around causing trouble. My own belief is that we will eventually find out that there were arms, because where do all these arms come from all of a sudden? How come all these supposedly normal citizens all of a sudden have arms that are out there, shooting off machine guns? There had to be some preparation, some training. Some arms were set aside, some people were organized, and at the appropriate moment, with the appropriate organization from Russia, this is my belief, I have no proof yet, I suspect we will find proof, then this thing was supposed to develop. So far, my impression is that the response of the people in east and southern Ukraine probably has disappointed Russia, because while there has been a lot of support for these, call them separatists, it has not been overwhelming. And I also suspect that in eastern and southern Ukraine, from what I read, and what would seem normal to me, it's a poor area. There's lots of people who have low-wage jobs or no jobs, and that the main interest of the majority of people is stability, security, the economy, and most people probably are not happy to see people running around with machine guns, storming buildings, and causing this kind of trouble. So that, and maybe Maybe there are those who strongly want to join Russia. Maybe that's 20%. I don't know. Maybe there are those who strongly want to stay Ukrainian, for whom that's important. But I also suspect that there's a large number of people who really don't care and who just like to have peace and quiet and a better standard of living. And I think that I spoke earlier about sort of competing ideologies or competing national identities. Western Ukraine has a very strong sense of their Ukrainian identity based in their language and wanting to carve this strong national identity and base it on the language. The people in the eastern and southern part of Ukraine, whether they are ethnic Russians or ethnic Ukrainians who culturally are Russians, they are more a part of the Russian world culturally. And I think their loyalties are probably divided and maybe flexible. And depending on, so if they get a strong propaganda barrage from Russia, that'll incline them one way. And I also have the impression from watching Schuster Live that the people in the Western Ukraine have this somewhat condescending attitude towards the people in the Eastern Ukraine. In fact, the big impression I get from watching Ukrainians on Schuster Live is the degree of arrogance and lack of I don't know, sort of mutually looking down on each other between the two sides. Among some, like you can't generalize. I think there are strong Ukrainian patriots in the East. There are people in the West who make a special effort to speak Russian, who want to, reach out to the people in the East. But then there are also those in the West who say the people in the East, they're all corrupt. There's lots of sort of lumpen proletariat out there, and so we need to educate them and bring them up to our level. Whereas the people in the East say, well, actually we enjoyed being Soviets. We had a lot of advantages in the old Soviet Union. At least we had proper education, medical care, and so forth. Now we have all this uncertainty. We have these rich oligarchs. Meanwhile, I've got nothing. And you guys want to go off to join Europe. We have no interest in joining Europe. We're happy with our identification with our Russian world. So there's all of these competing things. And it's almost as if you've got an East-West thing, but you've also got the sort of bourgeois people who, like to dress well and want to be European versus the sort of basic working class type. I mean, even the right sector, which is a Ukrainian nationalist organization, they are also more of a sort of a working class type of organization. They're not keen on the European Union either. So, and it's of course not obvious that the European Union being part of that is going to be a benefit. But now, of course, Ukraine, the government is kind of clinging to Europe as kind of a counterbalance to the pressure from Russia. So the whole thing is a bit of a mess. It's interesting in that regard to look at Putin's conversation with the media today, where he's talking about this Russian spirit. We Russians, he says, we have, we just had this influence of so many different people, so we have this unique gene pool. Like he's talking about as if some kind of genetic advantage that Russians have. And of course, we are so much more spiritual, so much more generous, because Westerners, they're more calculating, they're more practical, they're more money grubbing, they're more selfish. But we Russians, we're just more generous. Like in Russia, to have a lot of money doesn't mean anything. We have to give back. Well, of course, the reality is quite different. The reality is that in Western Europe, they have societies which are far more caring for the weak and the less advantage in their society, and also charitable donations and philanthropy is much more developed. Whereas in fact in Russia, the people behave quite selfishly, those who have the means to do so. And there's an absence of this social network and so forth and so on. And it's funny too, because Putin really, in other conversations that I've heard, he likes to identify Russia more with the sort of conservative values, which in a way are European, more kind of European conservative values before the present sort of liberal tolerance, social welfare type of system that exists in Western Europe. So Russians are more generous, Europeans are more selfish, but in fact, if you look at the reality, in fact, that doesn't really relate to anything real. So lots of this sort of nationalist hype, and maybe Putin needs it because economically Russia is going to be facing some very hard times, And so these activities basically distract people from the reality of their own situation, which in many ways is not much better than it is in the Ukraine. Better, but in many regions of Russia, not much better. I wanted to get back to some of the, because I got so much stuff. By the way, I should say that, you know, I watch Telekanal Dost, TV Rain, which is an excellent TV station. Prevents a lot of information. A lot of it, as it, on Schuster Live, is slanted. It's critical of the government. And a lot of things that they say are not true. So I don't have to buy everything that they say. But it is a perspective. And similarly at Echo Moskvy. Although Echo Moskvy does have more, a greater variety of perspectives. For example, on Schuster Live, whenever they show a blogger from, and TV does to the same extent, from Donetsk or from Lugansk, they'll always show someone who basically is favorable to the Kiev position. They won't show you a blogger who is favorable to the pro-Russian position. So I'm aware of that. And so you have to, no matter what source of information you use, you have to be a little bit careful that you don't buy the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker. In that regard, I'm posting a link to a speech made by a Russian professor at the leading sort of political relations institute, international relations institute in Russia, where he talks about how the government television in Russia is creating this reality for people. And a speech by him is very instructive because there is freedom of speech in Russia. Telekanal Dost is a proof of the freedom of speech in Russia. It is occasionally encroached upon. The famous professor of this same university who compared taking Crimea with Sudetenland, who was fired from his job, he was subsequently reinstated. Putin, at his conversation, said that he hopes that any undue pressure on Telekanal Dost, on TV Rain, he's going to make sure that there is nothing sort of non-commercial that prevents them from operating. So that what happens in Russia is that the government has such a quasi-monopoly on television and on mass media, and that they control that so well, and they create this reality so well, as is described by this professor. Of course, you have to understand Russian, that they can afford to have these people on the sidelines as a safety valve, and most Russians don't, they consider these Telekanal Dost, Echo Moskvy as traitors, fifth columnists, whatever, but it does exist. So that is encouraging. Now, what happened was, what else was I'm gonna forget it all. Well, there's so many examples about the sort of Putin and his mythical sense of Russia's, special role. And of course, they have appointed a minister of culture there who is very heavy into rewriting history. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a wonderful thing. And so all of this stuff is happening in Russia, and it's something that I think needs to be followed. There's no question that Russia has created an anti-Western feeling. I saw on one of Alexei Navalny's tweets a link to a picture of the train station in somewhere in Crimea, Sevastopol, or I don't know where, and it had this great big poster saying, agents of Western influence, and it had photographs of people who presumably were, I don't know, pro-Kiev people, I don't know who they were, but agents of Western influence right there on the train station. But getting back to what triggered this was this comment from one of my viewers, and he was saying, the West is encroaching on. So first thing is the West, he says, signed an agreement not to move NATO into Eastern Europe. All of my research shows that there was a verbal agreement between, at the very least, the German foreign minister at the time in 1990 and Maybe Baker, the US Secretary of State. When they were trying to get East Germany into NATO, there was a verbal agreement that they wouldn't move east. So there's no signed agreement, but at that time there was a verbal agreement. So obviously NATO has gone back on that tacit agreement. Now, you can also argue that, lots of agreements get broken because politicians, in order to get something now, will promise stuff, and when circumstances change, they kind of change. So similarly with Putin, Russia signed an agreement to respect the territorial integrity of Ukraine in exchange for their nuclear weapons, and then he decided that that wasn't convenient anymore, so he no longer respected the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So there are examples, but that's one of the main things that sticks in the craw. My own view is that countries like Latvia, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia have every right to feel threatened by possible aggression from Russia in one form or another. After what we've seen in Ukraine, all the more so. But the rhetoric from Russia has been that. And I go back to when I first started following Echo Moskvy back in 2008, just about the time of the Georgian-Russian conflict. Saakashvili, president of Georgia, unleashed a sort of artillery barrage on the city, the capital city of Ossetia. Ossetia had essentially been de facto independent since the early 90s, and there has been ongoing skirmishing between Georgian villages and Ossetian villages in that area. He unleashes an artillery barrage on Skinvali. And I read like Medvedev, the president of Russia, says, 2,000 people killed. This is our 9/11. Like, this is like, wow, traumatic. I'm saying, hold it now. 100 people. Oh, you know what? I'm going to have to finish this in a second video. That's the door. Hi there, yeah. So I was talking about, of course, Ukraine and Russian-Western relations, and relating back to 2008, when the Georgian troops bombarded the city of Skinvali. As I say, I don't remember, 100, 120 people died. Obviously, it was a vicious attack, but it wasn't 2,000 people. It wasn't genocide, as they called it in Russia, but it led to the Russians invading Georgia, and we had that short Russian-Georgian war. But that's when I became aware of the extent to which Russian leaders and the Russian media will distort the truth in order to promote this hysteria, nationalist hysteria internally. And subsequent, of course, that kind of thing has festered on. And I couldn't help but think, like, what did the Russians do when Chechnya had an independence movement? I mean, they didn't kill 120 people. They killed tens and tens of thousands of people. So there's a bit of a double standard here. But this double standard is a favorite theme amongst the Russians. So the other favorite, which this fellow mentioned again and commenting, was old Kosovo and the bombing of Serbia. And, you know, that why doesn't the rest of the world recognize the independence of Abkhazia and Ossetia, whereas they recognize the independence of Kosovo? Okay. And of course, then the NATO bombed Serbia. First of all, the whole Kosovo thing needs to be looked at within the context of the whole Yugoslav conflict, which started in 1991. And I don't disagree with those who say that Europe, particularly the Germans, were at fault in encouraging Slovenia initially and other components of Yugoslavia to break away from the country. By the same token, Milosevic was on a sort of a grand Serbian kick. And so to him, gets back to this sort of competing national identities again. He had the same arrogant attitude towards other Yugoslavs as we've seen in sort of the relationships between some of the people in the eastern and western Ukraine. There wasn't an attempt there to you know, try to find common ground. It was more a sort of imposing Serbian rights and privileges over Kosovars and over Croatians and so forth and so on. So as the country started to break apart, then it broke into you know, Croatia was going to, well, Slovenia initially defended themselves against the Serbian army. The Croatians, and here again, you know, I mentioned Croatia. I was in a restaurant in the interior of BC, and there were some people sitting there speaking the Slavic language, and I asked them where they were from, and they said they were from Croatia. And Croatia had just declared itself independent. And I always like to inform myself on these things, and I said, oh, that's interesting. And I said, yeah, Croatia is the best country in the world and stuff. And I said, but 30% of the population of Croatia are Serbs. What is going to happen to them? And their response was, they will have to leave. wow, you know, so that there is a degree of intolerance in some of these post-Soviet or post-communist countries where nationalisms have been kept under kind of a lid, and now it's like total lack of tolerance. Now, I'm not saying that Ukraine is like that. I have the impression it isn't, but there are elements of that there. And the hope in Ukraine is that the more sober-minded people looking for common ground will dominate, unlike what happened in former Yugoslavia. But then the whole Kosovo situation was one where the Serbs felt that because on Krasna, whatever it was called, Chornya Palanja or something, in 1450, this was a battlefield where lots of Serbs died fighting the Ottoman Turks. Therefore, that whole area should be theirs, even though 70 or 80% of the population was now Albanian. And so their solution to that was ethnic cleansing, just as they had done in Bosnia. So that by the time NATO acted in Yugoslavia, and I don't know whether that was the right thing to do or not, but at least they had this problem that several tens of thousands of people, if not more, had been killed, raped, ethnically cleansed in Bosnia and in Kosovo. That every week thousands of people were being displaced in Kosovo by the Serbian army. And Milosevic wouldn't back down. So NATO bombed Serbia. Net result was 550 people died, 300 people in Kosovo, 200 or so people in Belgrade. Most of the bombing was directed at military or what were considered to be strategic targets, including bridges for whatever reason. And but it's 550 people. I go back to what the Russians did in Chechnya. So the Russians get all bent out of shape over the bombing of Serbia, but I don't hear so much about the bombing of Grozny, for example. Both unfortunate, of course. Then Kosovo was then declared independent. Why not Abkhazia and Ossetia? Personally, for me, I mean, they've both been virtually independent since the early 90s. With all due respect to the Georgians, I understand that when with the breakup of the Soviet Union, Georgia was pretty heavy-handed in their dealing with the Abkhazians and the Ossetians. So yeah, I don't think that they're going to get those territories back anytime soon. I don't know. So to that extent, if the world was willing to recognize the independence of Kosovo, why not recognize the independence of those two countries? I guess you could argue that I don't know. It's a moot point. It's a moot point. Yeah, moot point. What can you say? The other thing, I'm trying to remember the other standard. You know, double. Basically, that's it. I think I've covered it there. Unfortunately, I don't have a picture of his all of his comments. So let me just finish off now with getting back to Ukraine and the hysterical propaganda war from Russia claiming that the horrible Banderovцы, rightist, fascist government of Kiev is using their military to suppress peaceful demonstrators in the east and southern parts of Ukraine. In any country, if you have people grabbing, seizing arms, or wandering around with automatic weapons, seizing government buildings, airports, the forces of order, police or army, are going to clamp down. In some countries more strongly, some countries less strongly. In Canada, in the early 70s, when we had separatists bombing mailboxes and kidnapping diplomats and government officials, the government of the time, Pierre Trudeau, brought out the army. Clamped down. I mean, I can only imagine in Russia if people were charging around seizing government buildings and waving some foreign flag, they would be dealt with much, much more harshly than has been the case in Ukraine. And I think the government has not only the right, but the responsibility to restore order. So the whole suggestion that somehow the Kiev government is acting without mercy and so forth is just pure nonsense, in my opinion. What is true is that the threat of Russian invasion is real, because Putin obtained permission from the Duma to invade Ukraine. A number of public opinion polls show that there's wide support in Russia for invading Ukraine, so that the Ukrainians have every right to feel concerned, and therefore that has definitely inhibited them in their response. They probably should have acted more firmly. They are also inhibited by the fact that the government in Kiev probably doesn't have good control over their police force or army, and so they've got to rebuild this after you know, those various security organizations. Many of them are probably loyal to Yanukovych, and or quite ambivalent as to whether they want to be Ukrainian or Russian. So there's a real problem there, but the problem has not been one of excessive use of force by the Kiev government, but rather by their inability, both because of their own division and ineptitude, and because of the pressure from Russia, their inability to respond the way probably a lot of the local people would like them to respond, because probably a majority of the local people would like to see law and order restored. So there you have it. I just wanted to share with you some of my thoughts on all of this. It's probably so long that most of you haven't survived until the very bitter end here. And I look forward to your comments, and I will get back to talking about language. Bye for now.